So we've talked about the end of the First World War. We talked about the beginning of the First World War. The beginning of the First World War was countries that wanted to fight a war because it would put them in a better place on the European sphere. It would maybe ease nationalism crises that they were dealing with. It would make men out of their boys. But after the war, nobody wanted to fight another war. This is something really important to take note of. Prior to World War I, war seems noble, war seems good for a nation. After World War I, war is to be avoided at all costs. All right? And a brief timeout with an important note to remember as we study history this year. We are studying individuals and events that take place in their own time. They don't have everything that you guys have in terms of knowing what is going to come next. All right? So when we talk about the events that ultimately lead up to the Second World War, when we talk about the League of Nations being established, what do the founders of the League of Nations not know? Yes?
Oh, they don't know that Hitler's going to be evil?
Sure. They don't know that Hitler's going to even exist, right? In 1920, they don't know Hitler's a thing.
It was just a house thing.
They don't know, when they established the League of Nations, that the League of Nations is going to fail. We know. Like today, the League of Nations gets... League of Nations, a lot of good that did. They don't know it's not going to work. They don't know the League of Nations won't keep the world out of war until the League of Nations doesn't keep the world out of war. So we've got to remember that. And we can't look back and be like, oh, you idiots, right? What do they know? They know that war, modern war, World War I, is the absolute worst thing to ever happen to humankind. And they don't ever want to have something like that happen again, right? Especially in a time where modern advancements are still taking place and military technology is still improving. So, in the aftermath of World War I, there is a treaty that's worked out, okay? This comes out of the Paris Peace Conference. You guys remember this from last year. There's a treaty that's worked out, will be known as the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is going to issue some punishments to the German nation. First and foremost, Germany is required to accept blame for the war, known as the War Guilt Clause. Germany accepting exclusive blame for the war is going to give the Allies the ability to sue Germany, to eventually force them to pay for the war effort. You've accepted responsibility, now you can pay for it. So Germany is going to be shackled with billions of dollars in reparations that they have to pay Britain and France and Belgium for the in Russia for the cost of the war, less to Russia, of course, for the cost of the war. Germany is going to be forced to be demilitarized. Once the pride of the German state, their army is now going to be reduced to 100,000 men, which is quite small in terms of early 20th century militaries. No navy, no air force for the Germans. And then Germany is going to lose territory, not only territory to Belgium and France and Czechoslovakia and Poland in Europe, but they're also going to lose all of their overseas holdings. So Germany's going to suffer pretty harshly in this treaty negotiation. But they don't suffer as badly as some countries would want. Remember, every country does what it does because it's in their own self-interest. So when the great powers were going to Paris to talk at the Paris Peace Conference, and when I talk about the great powers, we sometimes refer to them as the Big Four, but really it's the Big Three. When I say the Big Three, who are we're talking about? France, Great Britain, and the United States. Italy makes up the fourth of the Big Four, but they're really not running the show. All right? The American representative in Paris is President Woodrow Wilson. Anybody know the British Prime Minister in Paris? Not Chamberlain. We're going to talk about him soon. Yes, sir? David Lloyd George. Very good. David Lloyd George. Because some people need 3 first names. And then the French president? George the Tiger Clemenceau. Because some people need sweet nicknames. What's that? I don't know that he cried through the whole thing. That's not something I'm aware of. I don't think he would have been crying through the whole thing, but if that's something you know, I would love to read about it.
I think Paul was telling us, didn't she? She said he cried.
I don't know about that. So these three are going into negotiations with their own country's self-interest in mind. All right. Shh, guys, quiet, please. We understand that all three of these countries have different interests. America is on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Are they militarily, or have they ever been militarily threatened by Germany? Nope, they still aren't. America wants Germany back on its feet. The economic powerhouse that Germany can be would be good for the United States because we can do business with them. Britain, are they militarily threatened by Germany? Not really. Maybe a little more so than us, but they're still an island. They're not really that worried about Germany's military. So they can accept a demilitarized Germany. They're cool with that. But they don't need to break Germany all apart into pieces because they want Germany to get on their feet so they can be an economic trading partner with the British Empire. France, are they militarily threatened by Germany? Yes. Absolutely. In 1870 and again in 1914 they were invaded. France is absolutely threatened by Germany. So France doesn't want to see a Germany left to its own devices. France wants to see a Germany completely dismantled. So these negotiations go forward, and they're tough. It's not Britain and the United States and France against Germany in the negotiations. Germany doesn't have really a seat at the table. It's Britain and the United States and France all competing against each other. In the end, they compromise. And what is a compromise? When everybody gives up something so nobody is happy. All right? So in the compromise, ultimately what we're left is a disarmed Germany, a Germany that has lost some territory, a Germany that's got to pay harsh reparations, a Germany that had to accept guilt for the war, but a Germany that is left intact. The heart, the core of Germany is still there. So you're left with a bitter, angry, resentful Germany that is still in place. Had the French gotten what they wanted, Germany would have been broken apart and may have never been a threat again. Had the British and the Americans gotten what they wanted, Germany would have been able to possibly get on its feet much faster and might not have bred the resentment that they ultimately did. But what you're left with is really the worst of all situations. An intact Germany that feels abused. All right? Now, another aspect of the Treaty of Versailles that is worked into the treaty, it's actually a part of the Treaty of Versailles, is Woodrow Wilson's idea for the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, came up with, towards the end of the war, as the United States was getting involved, wrote up his 14 points. You guys remember some of these, right? 14 things that we should look towards in a post-war world. There are a lot of them. Open seas should be free for trade, and people should enjoy their own identity and rights to rule themselves. There were a lot of them. There were 14 of them. One of them was to create the League of Nations. All right? One of them was to create the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson wanted the League of Nations because he saw a League of Nations being what the world was missing in 1914. Maybe had a League of Nations existed in July of 1914, the July crisis that ultimately resulted in World War I might never have resulted in a war at all. Maybe it could have been talked out. So Wilson wanted a League of Nations more than anything else. So when it came to compromising, Woodrow Wilson was willing to give up a lot of his 14 points. For example, with ideas of self-determination. We know this phrase, self-determination, right? For a peoples to be able to determine for themselves how they want to be ruled. Woodrow Wilson talked a lot about self-determination in his 14 points. But in the end, not a lot of people got to determine for themselves how they wanted to be ruled. Polish people would. Czech people would. Vietnamese people wouldn't. Africans wouldn't. Arabs, for the most part, wouldn't.
The Irish.
Irish would. So do we get that there's a little bit of a... Why aren't Vietnamese people going to be able to determine for themselves how they want to be ruled in 1919? No, we're not communists yet. France. What about France? France controls Vietnam. Why aren't Indians going to be able to determine for themselves how they want to be governed? Because is Britain and France, are they going to fight a war to only give up their overseas empires? Absolutely not. So Woodrow Wilson is willing to compromise on a lot of his ideals, like self-determination, in order to get the League of Nations formulated. And it's actually worked right into the treaty. In fact, the Treaty of Versailles begins with the formulation of the League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson believes in his heart of hearts that all people of the world should be able to determine for themselves how they want to live. But he thinks, we can't do it now, so let's get the League of Nations first. And then eventually the League can work that stuff out. Unfortunately for Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations being a part of the Treaty of Versailles means that the Treaty of Versailles will never be ratified by the United States Senate. Oh, we have a constitution we have to deal with, right? Presidents don't sign treaties. Presidents can work out treaties. The State Department can orchestrate treaties, but presidents don't get to sign treaties.
And that's
The Senate does. Yes.
That's the issue with the current Iran deal.
It absolutely is. So the Senate approves treaties. And the Senate in 1920 is not down with approving the Treaty of Versailles because it has the League of Nations in it. Because the League of Nations might dictate the United States to actually go to war in Europe again. And what is the last thing the United States wants to do in 1920? Go to war in Europe again. So we never ratify the League of Nations. We never ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We never join the League of Nations. The most economically powerful and fastest growing nation in the world is not going to be a part of the League of Nations. It's still formed, though. The League of Nations does come to fruition. It is born. And the hope is that it will avoid war going forward in the future. Didn't get very far today. We will pick up where we left off in 2 days.